Welcome back to the second part of my series on using PixInsight. In this video, what I want to do is show you the user interface and where to find things and generally what's on offer. So what we have on screen at the moment is the end of a small project I have, which is to process an image of the globular cluster M3 from a colour camera. And to get to this image, I've gone through image calibration and then stretching and all those good things. But I've left it on the screen just to show you around what a typical working environment looks like and to give you a flavour of the things that you can do. So around the screen are a series of drop-down menus, as you expect with any Windows or Apple operating system, and there's also toolbars which give direct access to little tools that help you either visualize an image or set masks up and whatever. On the left hand side there are a number of windows that come out which have special functions. There's a process console that basically tells you what you've been doing on the image, and it gives a listing of all the things that have happened to it, and it's a useful check as to has something worked, has it been rejected, aborted, and also gives essential information about what it was doing and how well it did it. The View Explorer is something that's used to look at the different images that you have within your working environment, and it gives information about it as to what they are, whether it's colour, monochrome, what its resolution is, and so forth. There's a Process Explorer, and what this does is it gives a list of all the different processes that you can apply to an image, and this is one way of accessing the different tools, and I'll call them tools rather than processes. So it has a recently used bunch, it has the most used, and then it's got loads of tools which have been grouped together in logical groups. These are duplicated here at the drop-down menu, and you can access it either way. It just depends on what your preference is. Down the bottom is a File Explorer. So this is just like a standard File Explorer on Windows or Mac, but it has a special emphasis on images, and it gives you information on images, gives you a little preview in this area here, and can be useful for finding things and making sure that they are what they are. And lastly, down the bottom, which we looked at briefly in the first part of this video series, is the History Explorer. And what this does is it gives you the processing history for any chosen image, and an ability to wind back the history or to take a process or a tool out of that history and apply it to a different image. So they're used once in a while. These windows can be stuck in place, or they can just ping back, or you can actually close them permanently because they do occupy quite a bit of space. Now, when it comes to an image, so this is an image file that's operating at the moment, and there's some more here, and they have a blue cube shape. So here's another one that's a monochrome one that's used for some other purpose. And what is important to notice about these things is that they can be shrunk down to an icon like we have over here. They can be minimized to that extent, or it can be minimized to that extent and then it pops back up to here. If you've moved these around the screen and it's getting very untidy, if you do window arrange icons, they all ping back to the other side of this little orange line here, which can just tuck them out of the way. Now on this screen there are a number of view commands, so you can zoom in and out the view. You also have some fixed presets of 1 to 1, 2 to 1 and 1 to 2, which is useful if you just want to see what something looks like up close or even closer. And that's especially useful when you're looking at noise and trying to reduce noise, and it's difficult to see the noise when it's 1 to 1 or smaller. So you can also just temporarily zoom something and just keep on clicking it. The other thing you can do is you can do things like move it to fit the whole window and things like that. So there's a number of different view commands depending on what you're doing and how much real estate you have. So I'm just going to go back, and if I click this one down here with the two little squares, that brings it down to a sensible size, which is scaled to fit nicely within your work area. There's a couple other things to note. There's this little box around here which is labelled Preview 1, and what that is it basically produces a sub-image. And the nice thing about sub-images, if you click on the little tab here, it appears here. So this is this. Now, because it's only a part of the image, it's like a temporary offshoot, and you can apply a tool to it to check out what it's going to do. And because you're only applying to a portion of the image, it's much faster. The other thing you can do is there are a number of controls that allow you to do things to the image on a preview and not on the main one, and just flip backwards and forwards nice and easily to see what the effect was, or to completely reset what was happening. So previews are a handy way of evaluating a tool on a small subset of the image before you wait 2 minutes for it to apply it to the entire image. And so previews also have a useful feature that, for instance, if I was sampling a background level, and if I use this button here with a little arrow on it, it allows me to now move that preview window to somewhere else. I could, for instance, use this preview to sample the background level, or for instance the background color. I can create another preview by clicking this button up here and do one in the middle, and I can use that, for instance, for sampling the stars and the color of the stars. And I could bring up a tool that does the color balance, and the color balance is trying to balance the highlights and the shadow areas at the same time. And I can reference these two previews, so you take the dark values from preview 1 and the bright values from preview 2, and then apply it to the entire image. So that's another reason that previews are quite handy. And when you don't want them anymore, you can delete them with this little button here. So here's another preview, and I can delete it. The other thing to look out for is that the sidebar, if you just take the tab and just drag it, it's a simple way of creating a clone or a duplicate. And sometimes that's useful if you want to try something out, or you want to take your image and process it 2 different ways and then combine them later on. The other thing that happens with this sidebar, it has a couple of other uses. One is to do with masks, and the other is to do with creating temporary screen stretches. So this image has a grey tab, and that means that what you're seeing is what you will get. If I shrink that down and bring up this one here, this image looks very similar. It's uncropped and it's got some stuff around the corners which isn't very nice, but you notice that it has a green line running down the side of this, and that means that this has got a temporary screen stretch on it. Now, screen stretches are really useful for evaluating an image when it's just come off the camera and you want to see the effect of something without actually physically stretching the image beforehand. And the screen stretch is controlled by these icons up here with the little radiation symbol. There's a simple one that is what we're seeing now, and there's an extreme one that makes it even brighter, and they can be cancelled with the one with the little crosses in. So that is what the real image looks like. And the important thing about a screen stretch is it's not actually altering image data, it's only altering how it appears on the screen. But if you're doing something which does a very small change to the image whilst it's in this linear state, which you can see here, you won't be able to see what that change is. And so you apply a screen stretch first of all, and then when you do reduce noise or deconvolution or whatever it might be, you can see the effect as it will probably appear on the final image. The other thing to note is to do with masks. So there are different ways of applying masks, and one of the beautiful things about using a dedicated astrophotography program is you can do selective processing, and that's the major advantage over programs like the image processing sections of things like Nebulosity or MaximDL, is that you can mask off different parts of the image and apply different processes. So for instance, you can reduce the noise of the dark background layer but you can also at the same time sharpen and brighten up and increase the resolution of all the bright pixels. And you can do that with a set of masks. And there are a number of different ways of doing masks. So for instance, this one here is called a Loom mask, and it's a monochrome image which is basically a slightly blurred version of the stretched image that produces a black and white image. And if I'm to drag this tab here, and I drag it onto here, nothing happens. Now that's an important lesson. The reason that nothing happens is because this mask has already been cropped and this image has not. So I'm going to have to show you on the other image. So if I take my final image, which is the same dimensions as this one, and by the way, to find out the dimensions of an image, all you have to do is just put your mouse button over the icon and it tells you, gives you a little preview of the image, and it tells you what the size is, which is useful. So now if I grab this tab and drag it to here, you get a double square, and as soon as I release it, this tab goes brown, and what this means is that this image is now masked, and the mask buttons are along the top here. So for instance, this is another way of selecting a mask. If you press that button, you can actually just call up the name of the mask you want to apply. That deletes the mask. This inverts the mask. This enables it. So for instance, if I disable it, it's still there, but the tab has now gone back to grey. So enabling the mask makes it go back to brown, and this visualizes the mask, this one with a little spyglass on it. So the mask is masking off all the dark tones and leaving all the bright ones. And if I invert the mask, it does the opposite. So it's now masking off the bright tones and leaving behind the dark ones. So for instance, if I wanted to reduce the noise of the background, I would leave the mask in this state, apply some noise reduction, and then invert the mask, and then sharpen what's left. So that's a nice way of using a mask, and it gives you a quick view of what it looks like. And then I can delete the mask by hitting this button here. It removes the mask, but it hasn't actually physically deleted the image. Now, a couple of things that make it quite pleasant to use. So for instance, a lot of processes typically you only want them to work on bright tones, especially like sharpening. And one of the easiest way to create a mask is, especially when it's in a stretch state as it is now, is to simply drag that off and then drag it back. And that creates what I call a luminosity mask that's directly proportional to the luminosity in the original image. And that's a very nice, simple way of creating a basic mask on an image to, in this case, apply some sharpening, or in this case, to do some noise reduction on the background. So that's one little thing about masks. These are processes which I've used on the image but have not yet got rid of. So the processes don't physically disappear, and they always remember the last set of settings. There's a wonderful one called Multiscale Linear Transform, which basically can emphasize or de-emphasize structures in the image at different scales. If I double click it, it brings up what all the settings are, and if I click this X button here, it disappears. We should start talking about the process icons themselves. So these ones have been minimized onto the desktop, and you can bring them back to life either by double clicking them or clicking this little square. Now, one of the things that you can do with these is to apply it to several images. So for instance, I could apply this by just simply dragging this little triangle to an image and dropping it, and that'll apply that process to that image. And then I can apply it to another image by dragging it onto another image. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is, if this image has been identified with a blue bar, in other words it's the selected one, I can now just hit that square and it'll apply it to the selected image. The other buttons around the side, this one resets a tool back to its default parameters. This one is the documentation, if it exists, not always. And this one brings up a sort of console of instructions that we don't need to know about, because at this level we're not worried about the details behind the scenes. So the little icon at the top right hand corner gives an indication of what it does, but the nice thing about these icons is you can rename them. So for instance, if I drag this masked stretch, and instead of dragging this to an image but drag it onto the desktop itself, it forms what they call a process icon as opposed to a minimized process tool. And it's a much smaller image. So this one's quite large, but this one's quite small. And it's got process 01 written on it. And it's got a little n and a little d. So if I click on the little n, I can change the name. So I can just say initial stretch. So now I've got a tool that's labeled initial stretch, and the little d gives a description of what it does. In this case there is no description, but I could add one. Apply stretch to linear image. Okay, move that out of the way. So now if I click that, it tells me what I've done. And that can be useful because if you have a number of set tool settings which you know work every time, and there's not that many of them, you can give them a name, something meaningful, and you can store them on your user interface and reuse them and not get confused as to what they do. If it's not quite the settings you want, you can still double click it, which will bring it up, and you can alter a value. If I want to remember what it is after I've changed it, I need to drag it again to my desktop and give it a new process name, etc. So when you create this little icon, it fixes all the settings, but it doesn't stop you opening up the tool again and changing it and then creating another preset. So the beautiful thing about these little icons, when they're at this size, rather than the ones with the little Windows buttons on it, you can now drag that to your image and a little tick mark appears by the cursor. And if you let go of your mouse, it'll now apply that to that image. So you can create a number of preset tools that you can one by one drag to an image and apply the processing to that image very effectively and very quickly. The other couple of things around the window, we haven't looked along the bottom of the window here. So we have a name of all the different images, and if we click on them, it brings them up. That's another way of bringing up different images at different times. So I've lost one, so let's just arrange my icons. I've lost PSF somewhere. Do you see this scroll bar here? It doesn't go all the way to the right. When I shrunk down the screen in order to do a sensible size video, my original workspace was the entire 5K display, which is a bit too much for video editing. So there's another image stuck out here. So I'm just going to move it over here. And then hopefully, when I scroll that back, it doesn't disappear. There we go. That's better. So all the icons are minimized and put up here. And along the bottom here, there's a number of other things. So these are the different workspaces. And at the moment, I'm only using one workspace. The others are blank. But you can move things between workspaces by just dragging either an image or an icon and dragging it to a new workspace and dropping it. So now if I look here, I've got PSF on here, go back to the original workspace and it's disappeared off here. And that can be useful by putting different parts of your image on different workspaces. You might put the color on one workspace, you might put the monochrome and luminance on another, you might put narrowband on a third one, and so forth. The other thing is this little tick box here, it's the readout mode. So if I bring up an image and I now pass my cursor over the image, you see at the bottom of the screen it gives two things. There's the coordinates in pixels and then the red, green, blue values, and this is in a decimal value between 0 and 1, but you can change that. So if you click on this button here, you can change the readout mode. So for instance, I can change the probe size, I can change whether it's an integer or a normalized value. So at the moment I've got 4 decimal places, but I can equally change it to a simple 16-bit image number. So if I change it now to 16-bit, so now the red, green, blues are 16-bit values. So if I go on to the very brightest part, it's in the 50,000s. So that can be useful if you're just trying to check and compare different values. I typically use a normalized range between 0 and 1, because I don't then have to remember what is 90% of the full range, and I normally use something like 4 or 5 decimal places. So I'm just going to choose back 5 decimal places. So I know that any star approaching 1 will only be white because there's no differentiation between colours. So I typically try and keep all my stars between 80 and 90% maximum, otherwise I start to lose star colour. That's a quick look around the screen. There's a couple other things here on the bottom right, which is telling you a little bit about this particular image, and if I chose a different image it would give me a different amount of data. So for instance, if I do this one, actually that's the same one cloned, not very clever, let's do that one. So this is saying down the bottom here, this is a grey image, it's 78 megabytes and it's 32-bit. Useful thing about the data, the images, the workspaces, and you get a sense of how things are put on the screen and where to find them. The other thing just to look out for is to do with the tools themselves. So the process tools, you can get a complete list, which is fairly daunting, or you can find them in sensible groups of like tools. So anything to do with geometry or changing the size, orientation, all classified under geometry. Anything to do with lining up different images either to a comet or to stars is under registration, and so on. The other one is next to it is called script. Now what these are is predetermined groups of tools that are typically executed automatically. Sometimes it's done by the developers of the original application, sometimes it's done by well-meaning individuals. So for instance, batch pre-processing script is a script that uses existing tools in a semi-automatic way that allows you to do all your calibration of your files from your CCD. And it applies generic parameters, much less control over what parameters are alterable, but it does a very good job, very efficiently. And if you do need more control, what you can do is then go back and do the separate parts of the calibration process on their own using separate calibration tools. But it's a nice, convenient way of getting going and getting an instant result. And even, although I wouldn't recommend it for the best performance, you can even get a stacked image as well at the end here, so you get an appreciation of what you've got. But scripts are useful, they're very inventive. For instance, their scripts are noise reduction scripts, which are amazing if you're using a monochrome camera, and they can simply calculate using the parameters from the sensor and do a remarkable job of reducing noise in the image as you first get it after stacking. And there's various other things like image analysis. It will do things like work out all the noise in an image. It can solve an image, it can tell you what you're looking at. It can do things like extract different levels of detail at different scales from an image and create multiple images in different scales and so forth. There's one on benchmarks that basically tells you how fast your machine is, and there's lots of utilities. The utilities cover everything by doing things like screen stretching differently on each different color channel, to allowing you to edit the fits header, allows you to do things like mosaics, which are quite fun to do when you've got the time. And it does things like narrowband combinations. So when you bring up this, it allows you to select different source images for narrowband and color filters, and allows you to plug and play different combinations to get the right blend of colors and palettes. So scripts are a useful way of expanding the abilities of PixInsight, and you can think of them almost as like little mini programs. With that general introduction to the interface, what we're going to do next is take an example image and work through the popular steps to get to a final image in a series of videos. Now, one thing we need to be very careful about is that there is no such thing as a prescribed order or prescribed settings on any of the tools. Those who are looking for that, often who are coming from like a Photoshop background, will be disappointed. And that's not peculiar to PixInsight. That is the same for any imaging application. Processing a galaxy is completely different to processing a globular cluster as we have here, which is completely different to processing gaseous nebulosity. They require different tools at different times in different strengths. And so you're not going to get a recipe that you can follow that will work on every image. What you're going to get is an appreciation of what to try and in what order. So that's a key point, because a couple of comments about the information on PixInsight in my books. Some people love it and some people are looking for that very prescriptive method of what each tool does and exactly what settings to use. That really isn't a realistic proposition for anything other than one image. And since you're not processing my images, it's irrelevant what I use to some extent. So I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to pick up again probably at the beginning of this image, which is a simple one to do to start with calibration, and then work through the stretching processes, reducing noise and sharpening. Thanks for watching.